I think the Supreme Court should strike down affirmative action, finally put a nail in that coffin. Okay, this is a mistake that was made decades ago. Let's recognize the mistake for what it was and at least move on to a better way of rectifying alleged racial inequities in outcomes. There are racial inequities in outcomes, but what accounts for that, I think, starts at a very young age in the families and in broken public schools starting as early as kindergarten or preschool. Go upstream and fix those problems instead of using this cosmetic Band-Aid on the back end of the process. Because you know what? If affirmative action worked, then you wouldn't need the same racial minority groups who needed it to get into boarding school, who then need it to get into college, who are then the exact same racial minority groups that then need it to get into graduate school, who are then the exact same racial minority groups who need it to get into the workforce. If it was working, you wouldn't need to double count or quintuple count at every step of the cascade. And I will tell you, I was at Harvard for college, I was at Yale Law School. I see it firsthand. It's the same groups, the same people that require the same affirmative action programs every time through. That means it's not working. It's a pretty good sign that it's not working. It's also a disservice to even the qualified members of those minority groups who do get those positions because of merit, because no one can tell the difference. At the end of the day, if they're going to reward people of certain races, well, even if somebody scored really highly or was excellent in their performance, they're going to be judged in an unfair way by their non-favored peers. And so, in the first instance, it is this form of anti-white and anti-Asian racism. One of the things I talk about in Nation of Victims was actually a study, the last rigorous study that was conducted on this as well. I think it was by this guy Espenshade, who found that when you look at for like elite colleges, I think he looked at the top 10 elite colleges or 10 of the elite colleges, there was an over 400-point gap between SAT scores that an average Asian applicant would have to score versus the average black applicant. Let's keep in mind this is a 1600 scale test where I believe you can't score less than a 400, literally. 400 is the lowest score you can get. And the difference between the Asians who apply to those colleges and the black people who apply to those colleges is an over 400-point delta. Now, nobody talks about affirmative action for the NBA or the NFL, but if you were to apply this to the NBA or NFL, it would be the equivalent of, asking someone who's black to make a half-court shot, but someone who's Asian gets a stair step right up to the hoop to go do a slam dunk. It's something that would ruin basketball. Nobody would want to watch basketball or watch football if it was informed by principles of affirmative action. We shouldn't think it's anything different in science or engineering classrooms either. It's an assault on merit. It's an assault on excellence. And I've said this before, I said it in the book, I'll say it again. An assault on merit and an assault on excellence is an assault on the American soul. Part of the essence of what it means to be American is to be able to pursue excellence unapologetically. And affirmative action, I think, I think I can pretty confidently say, I think it is the single greatest form of institutionalized racism in the United States today. Anti-white, anti-Asian racism, but which then creates a backlash wave of new anti-black racism that we otherwise would not have had but for the grievance that affirmative action creates amongst the people who are penalized by it. So that's what I say.
You ever think, the creation of the grievance is intentional?
I think there's a lot that happens behind closed doors that is explained by cynical motivations. I just don't think this is the one case that fits that description. I don't think the creation of the grievance was intentional. I think the creation of the white savior complex that is indulged by creating a system that gives back to black people who supposedly couldn't hack it on their own, that's an indulgence of sort of a white savior complex. But I don't think that they intended to foster grievance. I think they intended to foster gratitude. So I think instead what happened is they created new grievances in other members of the disfavored races in this game we're talking about, whites and Asians, that then created new forms of racial animus towards the people who were perceived to have taken their spots. And then you get on an airplane and you see a black pilot and you say that, well, I know that they just eliminated testing requirements because of a mandate to achieve racial equity. I think many people will. They won't say it out loud, but they will think twice when they see the black pilot in the cockpit wondering if they're in the hands of a slightly less qualified pilot than they otherwise would have been in a world without affirmative action. And that is no one's fault other than the people who created the system that allowed one to even possibly make that inference. That is what I call true systemic racism. That is the affirmative action is the systemic racism that's still here in America today. And I'm sorry to say it will then create the new kind of racist, anti-black racism that we had spent so many decades moving on from.
I want to shift gears a little bit. Essentially, you make the argument that it's not just the left that is basically thinking of themselves as victims. It's also conservatives, very much so. You have a whole chapter dedicated to this, right? And then you kind of end up in this arms race of victimhood. So I want to get you to talk a little bit about that. You also issue a challenge, and the challenge is, we have to lay down our arms, right? But then there's a lot of people that might not think it's been a fair game, fair battle. So tell me.
Yeah, so the chapter is entitled Conservative Victimhood. And this is one of my reflections and one of my concerns is that I worry that this culture war we're in ends not with a bang, but with a whimper, where both sides are infected with the same cancer, yet still continuing to fight each other, not knowing that they're actually members of the same victimhood tribe. And one of the points I make in this chapter is that there are legitimate reasons for conservative victimhood. We could spend hours talking about them, right? Some of them I even lay out in Woke Inc., by the way. Others of them I didn't lay out in Woke Inc., but are more economic in nature. Okay, you think about, let's take the policy decision that we made in this country for the dollar to be the reserve currency of the world. I think that is a good thing for the United States, by the way, for the dollar to be the reserve currency of the world. It gives us control of the global financial system. It's what allows us to freeze a terrorist's assets on demand. It is what lowers borrowing costs for the United States. But if the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, that means that there's a little bit of artificial extra demand for the dollar above and beyond what would have existed under market conditions where the dollar was not the reserve currency. What does that mean? That's an artificial buying pressure that pushes up the average price of the dollar, so we have a strong dollar. But a strong dollar is actually bad for exporters because that means their goods are incrementally more expensive, artificially more expensive on the global stage. So it's great for importers in the United States, but it's bad for exporters, bad for manufacturers. Well, they're left holding the bag. It's a great policy that grows the size of the pie for everyone in the United States overall, but leaves one group of people, people who live in today's Rust Belt, holding the bag. And you go to the next policy. Think about student loan forgiveness. That's recent in the news. Well, again, somebody who borrowed money to go buy a truck or whatever it is and build a career as a trucker in that industrial Rust Belt, they didn't get their loans forgiven for buying that truck, even though somebody who went to, Bryn Mawr College or whatever it might be did for being a humanities major. I'm not saying that, we can question the merits of that policy. I personally think that policy was a boneheaded policy, but put that to one side. That's the same group of people then left holding the bag. Then you look at where's military enrollment coming from. Well, it turns out that we do need a military to defend this country, that we don't get to live the free lives that you and I live without actually having people who are willing to defend it. Well, again, same group of people holding the bag. Then you look at the intellectual property system. Well, the intellectual property system is effectively a government-created subsidy to knowledge-based industries, and no subsidy is free. It effectively comes at the cost of manufacturing industries, the same manufacturing industries and people who worked in it who were penalized by the dollar as reserve currency policy framework that created the strong dollar. So anyway, I could go on and in a rigorous a way as one could want, hopefully, paint the case for conservative victimhood, Trumpian victimhood, justified reasons for victimhood that resulted in the election of Trump in 2016 as the expression of that frustration. Got it. But you know what else we could do? Go to the left-leaning version of this conversation. We're here in New York City. I'm sure there are a lot of them happening. There'll be the same sob story told by somebody else about the black victimhood narratives, about redlining in this country.